I welcome you all to the module 2, which is titled as Biological Basis of Behavior. So, in this module 2, we are talking about what is the biological basis of human behavior, how biology impacts psychology and the various behaviors that we display. So, this is the second lecture of the module 2 and overall this is the lecture number 4. So, today's lecture is titled as Heredity, Environment and Behavior. So, in today's lecture, we will specifically focus on how genetics influences human behavior and how genetics interacts with the environment. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture. So, the last lecture or lecture number 3 was also part of the same module, that is the biological basis of behavior. In that lecture, we have discussed elaborately about the nervous system, the various divisions of nervous system and how nervous system influences our behavior. Then we started talking about more specifically the relationship between how the brain, human brain and behavior. So, we discussed the various aspects of human brain, how brain is divided into various lobes and so on, how it is divided into 2 hemispheres and each hemisphere is again divided into 4 lobes. We also discussed that brain can be divided into hind brain, forebrain, midbrain and so on. We also talked about how the concept of lateralization of the brain in terms of 2 hemispheres and how these 2 hemispheres has specialized function and how they interact with each other. We also discussed the concept of brain plasticity also. So, in the concept of plasticity is also very important, that how brain is a dynamic organ that sometimes takes over function of some other damaged part of the brain and so on. And at the end we discussed the endocrine system, how endocrine system releases hormones in the blood and how that influences our behavior. So, we have elaborately discussed about all these aspects in the last lecture. So, in today's lecture we will be focusing on the concept of nature nurture debate, where the idea is what is the contribution of genes and what is the contribution of environment in our behavior. We also talk about how genes influences our personality and our psychological aspects. We will look into direct and indirect genetic influences. We will also look at how environment can modify genetic influences. In connection to that, we will also talk about the concept of epigenetics. So, these are some of the concepts that we will be discussing in today's lecture. So, let us start today's lecture. So, the first concept that we will be touching upon is the concept of nature versus nurture in determining human behavior. So, this is one of the oldest debate or discussion in the science, and also this can be found in the psychological aspects. This is called as nature versus nurture debate. Now, this debate or this whole concept focuses on, is our behavior governed by genetics or nature or nurture, which also means environment or culture and so on. So, our behavior is, to what extent it is determined by the genetics or the nature part of it, and to what extent it is determined by the nurture part of it or the environment part of it. So, if you look at how this term came into existence, Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin, he is credited with popularizing this whole debate of nature versus nurture, where Galton believed intelligence was largely inherited, means largely it is determined by the genetics. So, that is the first this whole term nature versus nurture debate actually became popular from this idea given by the Galton. Then over the next 150 years, many thinkers engaged into different aspects of this discussion, engaged in the spirited debate about what is the contribution of genes and environment in human behavior. So, there have been many ideas associated with that. We will not go too much into specific details of it. So, although this debate continues, most psychologists, if you look at the psychology as a discipline, it is generally believed or understood that human behavior is influenced by a combination of genetics and environment. So, it seems now in this stage of understanding that it is meaningless to just talk about whether gene is responsible for behavior or environment is responsible for behavior. For almost every behavior or expression of human behavior, there can be some contribution of genetics and some contribution of environment. So, this contemporary version of this debate, nature versus nurture, is typically framed in terms of what is the relative contribution. So, there is no absolute contribution of one or the other, there is always a relative contribution, you know. In some cases, gene may play a little more important as compared to environment and the vice versa. So, this relative contribution of nature and nurture is particular in a particular behavior than about just nature or nurture. So, now the debate is mostly focuses on, or the studies mainly focuses on, what is the relative contribution of either genetics or the environment. So, the impact of gene depends on both the gene itself and the environment. So, even if you look at the research when the genetics influence a certain behavior, it is not completely genetic influence, you know. The impact is always, you know, the impact of the gene always find expression through the interaction of the environment. For example, a gene that heightens stress reaction matters more in stressful setting. So, let us say there can be some genetic contribution to the stress reaction, you know, gene makes you more vulnerable, but this expression of genetic contribution will only express when there is an environment for stress. So, it is always this interaction that happens, and this combination of this interaction that gives the expression of a particular trait or a particular behavior. So, asking whether behavior depends on hereditary environment is generally meaningless, as both are essential, both has their own contribution. So, looking at more of a relative contribution of each of them makes more sense in the contemporary research perspective. So, let us look at how genes can contribute to personality and different aspects of behavior. Now, genes play a significant role in shaping our biological traits and behavior. So, there is no doubt about it, because it is the genetic information that is responsible for our expression as a human being. If you look at the physical aspects of our body, it is largely determined by the genes. Our height, our skin color, kind of hair that we have is largely genetically contributed. So, there is no doubt about it. So, even in our psychological aspects also, the kind of, you know, the personality kind of trait that we have also could be contributed by genes also. So, normally, so let us just, before we talk about how genetics contributes to personality, let us see how the research in this area is done to find out the contribution of gene in a particular trait, how it is done, and little bit of basics of how genetics looks into that. So, normally when we say each cell in the human body has 23 pairs of chromosomes. So, in total there are 46 chromosomes, half of this comes from the mother, half comes from the father. So, that is how. So, if you look at any cell in our body, there will be 23 pairs of chromosome, half comes from the father, half comes from the mother. This is how all the information comes, and that determines our, you know, characteristics. Now, genes are found in the nucleus of the cell. So, if you take any cell, so there is a nucleus. So, there will be cell, there will be nucleus. In that nucleus, there will be chromosomes, and these chromosomes are basically tiny spaghetti like structures. These are made of DNA, and this gene is a particular section of that DNA. Is gene particular sequence or section of that particular DNA in the chromosome is a gene. So, single chromosome can have hundreds or even thousands of genes. So, this is how the genes are there in our every cells of our body. So, genes are composed of DNA and they guide synthesis of protein molecules, acting as source of information for biological development and which can ultimately influence our psychological aspects also. So, this is like genes are information which further stimulates protein synthesis and the biological development and everything, all the informations are coded in the gene. So, this is how it is shown in the diagrammatically. So, if you see the cell, so there is a nucleus, in that nucleus these are chromosomes, if you see these are all chromosomes, and this chromosome is made of DNA, and a sequence of DNA or particular section of the DNA is called as a gene. So, it is very important to understand that genes may not, most of the time, may not directly control behavior. You know, it may give expression to a lot of these physical aspects of our body, but in terms of behavior and psychological aspects, genes most of the time do not directly control those aspects. You may not find a single gene for like why someone is extrovert, why someone is introvert. So, the people have not found a particular gene that determines somebody is introvert or extrovert. Instead, gene influence personality characteristics indirectly or directly, influencing biological aspects. So, it will influence certain biological aspects, your vulnerability, your reaction patterns, through hormones release and so on, through release of chemicals and so on, through influencing glands function, and then ultimately that can influence your psychological aspects. We have already seen in the last lecture how hormones, the secretion from the glands influences us psychologically and so on. So, genes could influence a lot of this biological function which can ultimately influence our psychological functions. So, most of the time genes have indirect influence when you talk about how it influences behavior and psychological functions. So, in that context there is a branch of study which is called as behavior genetics. So, this is behavior genetics. It is a field of study that explores the role of genetic factors in shaping human behavior and traits. So, as the name suggests, this particular branch of study looks into how genetics or genetic factor shapes human behavior and traits. What is the role of genetics in traits? So, that is the whole idea of behavior genetics. This is what we are looking in this particular lecture. So, this behavior genetics seeks to understand how both genes and environmental factor contributes to individual differences in behavior, personality, mental health and other psychological characteristics. Obviously, when we talk about influence of gene, it is never 100% contributed influenced by genes. So, always the environment will also be a part of it. So, behavior genetics by default also looks at the influence of environment on a trait and what is the contribution of genetics also on a trait. So, by default you cannot neglect or remove environmental influences when we look at influence of genetics, because it is most of the time it is a combination of these two factors. So, behavior genetics use certain concepts such as heritability. What does that mean? Is that it refers to a proportion of observed variation of a trait within a population. So, heritability means if you look at a population or a group of people, to what extent a particular trait can be considered is to what extent this variation in this particular trait can be attributed to genetics. So, it provides an estimate of extent to which genetic factors influence individual differences in a particular trait. So, to what extent genetic factor influences a trait, but it is at the population level, it is not at the individual level. So, that is what heritability means. So, heritability is a population specific, not an individual trait. So, you cannot talk about that gene influences let us say 50% in a particular individual, but we can talk about certain percentages at the population level. For example, we can say 90% of height in a given population is heritable. That means, in a particular population, if you see the difference in heights, we can say height is contributed. What is the height of that individuals in a particular population? The 90% of it can be attributed to genetics. So, but we cannot talk about person X height is 90% contributed by genetics. We do not talk like that in the individual sense, but it is mostly spoken in terms of population level. So, that is called heritability. So, from the example that we talked about, 90% contributed by the height is contributed by the genetics. Here 90% of the variation of height among individuals in a given population is attributed to population. So, this is the important population part is very important, it is not at the individual level. So, this means that if you were to look at a large group of people, most of the differences in how tall they would be due to differences in their genes rather than the environmental factors. So, that means height is largely contributed by genes because 90% is contributed by that. So, in a population we can talk like that. We cannot say John's height is 90% heritable or determined by genes in that population. So, particular individual we cannot say talk heritability in that sense. So, heritability is also not a constant value, it keeps changing depending on changes in the environment and so on. So, it is a statistic applicable to a specific population in a particular time and set of condition. So, in a particular time period, it is considered that this is the percentage of genetic contribution which may change later also. So, changes in the environment can alter heritability, making it high in one population and low in another end. So, there can be fluctuations also because sometimes environment can influence the expression of genes also. We will look into that also. Now, what is the process or what is the method or methodology by which behavior genetics studies to find out the contribution of genetics and the environment in a particular trait? One of the best sample to study influence of genes and environment on a trait or a behavior is twins. So, these are many large scale twin studies were conducted, which gave this whole understanding or the concept of what is the contribution of genes or environment in a particular trait is typically done through the studies of twin studies. Now, twin studies are common method used in behavior genetics to estimate the contribution of genes and environment in a specific traits. Why twins? Because there are two types of twins, identical twins who share 100% same genes, fraternal twins who share 50% of genes just like any other siblings. So, if you see twins, so we have identical and another called fraternal or non-identical also called. So, this is called non-identical. So, if you see, so there are two types. So, identical twins are basically they have 100% same genetic information. So, that is why identical twins, if you look at them, you generally outside family people cannot recognize who is who. They look exactly same. The reason is their genetic information, that the genetic information that they have is exactly same. Genetically they are 100% same if you look at identical twins. Fraternal or non-identical twins are generally they have 50% same genes just like any other siblings. So, fraternal or non-identical twins, they do not look similar, they may look very different also. So, by comparing identical twins with fraternal twins, we can have some idea about what is the contribution of gene, because if identical twins are more similar in certain psychological traits and characteristics as compared to let us say fraternal twins, there is a high chance or probability that genetics is playing more important role, but obviously that is also not, we cannot be fully sure about that, we will look into that also. But in general, because identical twins have same genetic contribution, so they are more likely to be, if they are more similar in a trait, that means gene is more likely to be contributing as compared to let us say environment. So, let us consider two logical consideration or assumptions in such studies. Monozygotic twins means identical twins, this is another term for identical twins. Monozygotic twins because they come from the same cell, same zygote. So, therefore, they are called monozygotic twins. Therefore, they are exactly same in terms of genetic information. So, if monozygotic twins share identical genetic makeup, any difference observed between them must be attributed to environmental influence. So, if identical twins are 100% same in from genetic point of view, but despite that let us say there are certain differences in their characteristics, then we can say it is not because of genes, but because of environment, because genetically they are same, they should be same. Despite that, if there are differences, that means we can say this difference is coming from the environment. So, this is one assumption. Second assumption is, as monozygotic twins are more genetically similar to each other than dizygotic twins. Dizygotic means fraternal twins. So, if a specific trait is influenced by genetics, monozygotic twins should exhibit greater similarity. So, if something is, if you compare monozygotic and dizygotic twins, then if something is more influenced by genetics, that means monozygotic twin should be more similar in that trait, because they are same in genetics as compared to dizygotic twins, because they are genetically different, 50% different. So, this is another assumption. So, by studying monozygotic and dizygotic twins, identical and fraternal twins, researcher can compare their similarity on a trait of interest to determine to what extent genetic factors can contribute. But there is a problem in this also. Can we make such conclusion with full surety? Only studying monozygotic and dizygotic twins, is it enough to understand the contribution of genes and environment? So, there is a catch here, because monozygotic twins may resemble each other or they may be more similar because they are treated more alike or because they have same environmental influences. So, let us say these monozygotic twins, because they look exactly same. They may be similar not because of genetics, but maybe because they are treated similarly, because they look exactly same. They live in the same family environment. So, one can ask this question, they may be more similar simply because they are treated similarly or they are in the same environment. So, how do you separate the influence of environment here? So, for that researcher found a solution, and solution is that they try to locate identical twins which after birth they were separated. Now, they are in the different environment. Within the let us say 5 or 6 months of the birth, one of the twin was taken some by other family, maybe it was adopted or maybe some other reasons. So, researcher tried to identify or locate such twins who were separated after birth. Now, since they are in the different environment, there is a very no chance that they are treated similarly, because environment is very different, family is very different, they are not in the same family. So, environment is completely different. Now, if we can find such kind of twins and then despite different environment, if they still show similarity, then we can be very confident that this similarity is because of genetics, because now environment is very different. So, that is the best sample to study the influence of genes. Twins who are reared apart from each other, after the birth they were separated and they are reared apart. So, earlier adoption practices sometimes replace twins with different families. For example, there are many famous cases which were part of lot of this project. For example, one case was the case of Jim twins. This was part of or participants in one of such studies. Both these twins, they were identical twins, but they were separated after birth and they were reared in a different families. Both were named Jim by adopted parents, both had the same name. It is kind of very, it may be an accidental thing that they were also named same by the adopted parents also. They also showed same hobbies, carpentry, drafting, built on a bench around a tree. Even though they were separated after birth, they showed same hobbies. Both worked as deputy sheriffs. The profession was also almost same kind of professions they were doing. Shared similar habits like nail biting, weight gain at same age, smoked same brand of cigarettes, drove Chevrolet, vacationed in Western Florida, each married to someone who named as Linda, divorced and then married again to someone else whose name was also incidentally same. Sons were also named same, each had a dog named Toy and so on. So, lot of this could be accidental, but if you can see, it was even though they were separated, lot of aspects of their life are almost same, including names of their child and partner and so on. Some of this could be very accidental, but still you can see the kind of similarity they had even though they were separated after birth. So, this is a very famous case which showed even though when they are separated and brought up in a very different environment, still they showed lot of similarity, these identical twins. Some of this could be coincidences, but many other monozygotic twins reared apart also reported many such striking similarities. So, lot of these large twin studies, especially who looked at twins, monozygotic twins who are reared apart, or also compared dizygotic twins in the same family and some twins in the different family, they had all kinds of combination of such twins, and lot of these studies showed even when monozygotic twins are reared in a different family, they have shown so many different similarities in lot of psychological traits. For example, some of the findings are listed here. Monozygotic twins resemble each other more strongly than dizygotic twins. So, it is a comparatively, as compared to dizygotic twins, monozygotic twins showed more similarity in the following characteristics like hobbies, vocational interests, personality test scores, trust in others. They are very similar, more similar in monozygotic twins even though they are reared in the different families as compared to dizygotic twins. Political beliefs, probability of voting, job and life satisfaction, probability of mental illness, consumption of coffee and fruit juices, morningness versus night owl preferences, like all these are some of the examples of characteristics and traits. They were much more similar, monozygotic twins were more similar as compared to dizygotic twins in those traits. So, what is the implication of all these findings? So, genetic influences not only physical traits, but also wide range of behaviors, preferences, psychological tendencies also, because we can be very sure, because we are studying monozygotic twins who are reared in the different families. So, environment was different. Despite such differences, they were very similar in certain traits, that means gene is contributing more here. So, genetics also contributes to lot of behavioral preferences and psychological tendencies. Obviously, research shows that not every trait has same genetic contribution. Some trait could be more influenced by genes as compared to others. So, these are some of the example of certain characteristics, but not all trait have similar genetic influence and so on. So, there can be differences within the traits also. So, how gene influence behavior? So, if you look at a lot of this evidence from twins and adoption studies, research consistently show that at least some moderate heritability for almost lot of these behaviors. For example, moderate heritability means at least, even though it is not very strong, but at least moderate level of genetic influence is there in lot of these traits. For example, experience of loneliness, moderate heritability, these are all research findings. Neuroticism as a trait, neuroticism as a trait means it is about emotional stability. This trait shows to what extent you are emotionally stable. Some people are more little bit of emotionally unstable, they get easily irritated and disturbed. So, that means they are high on neuroticism. So, it is one of the trait of big 5 factors, which we will talk later. It also shows moderate heritability, time spent watching television, religious devoutness, moderate heritability. So, lot of this shows moderate heritability means there is a some when this moderate heritability is expressed in the real life, there can be it could be a lot of similarity in terms of expression. So, that means genetics influences to a large extent to lot of these characteristics. Some of the exceptions were the choice of religious domination shows zero heritability. That so, genes may influence how often you attend services, but not which religion you practice and so on. Which religion you choose may be it depends on what kind of environment you find yourself, but how devout you are and how do you practice and so on, lot of this could be genetically influenced and so on. But if you see lot of this here, it is shown it is not 100%, it can be lot of largely determined by the genetics, but still it is never 100%. So, environment will always have some influence on it. So, genes do not rigidly determine behavior in whatever we have seen, instead they may influence certain tendencies, predisposition, certain preferences. So, by influencing your biology or some biological aspects, it can affect traits like personality, motivation, habits, which then shape behavioral outcomes. So, certain tendencies like certain traits, certain motivation, certain habits, it can influence and that can ultimately lead to certain behavioral outcomes. So, a lot of this is actually an indirect influence. For example, gene might predispose someone to be more social, more anxious, more disciplined. It can create certain tendencies, because of which one can be little bit more socially oriented, somebody may be little more anxious. So, it will create those tendencies only, not very rigidly, but in a sense it will create certain tendencies, which can ultimately indirect influence so many behavioral outcomes in your life. So, genes influence a broad range of behaviors by shaping psychological predisposition, but cultural environmental context determine their specific expression. Whether those genetic influence will express itself or not, that is determined by the environment. For example, which religion you belong versus how religion devout you are. So, these are like certain environmental context will determine how it is expressed. So, that is where we say genetics influence interact with the environment to express a trait. So, there can be certain tendencies in the genetic information, but it will only express itself when certain environmental situations comes about. So, that it express because of those environmental situation you are put into it. So, it is always an interaction like this. So, as we have said, mostly in the psychological context, lot of it is actually an indirect influence. So, there can be some direct influence and some indirect influences on the behavior from the genetics. So, direct influences mostly in the biological context in the nervous system. Gene can affect behavior by altering brain development or sensory receptors. So, these are like direct influences are only in the biological context, and that biological context will ultimately influence psychological context. For example, food preferences are partly shaped by number of taste buds on the tongue, which is largely determined by the genetics. So, a lot of what kind of food you prefer could be largely determined by the genetics, because it depends on the taste bud on your tongue, which is largely determined by the genetics. So, it is a biological influence. Obviously, you can lot of preferences could change based on what kind of food you keep taking and so on. So, environment could also influence there, but it could be largely a genetic direct influence also. Now, mostly in the context of psychological aspects, there is an indirect influence of the genetics outside the nervous system. So, genetics may influence or shape behavior through effects of other biological systems. For example, gene may influence body anatomy such as being unusually good looking and so on. For example, gene can influence so many other aspects like how one looks, what kind of body anatomy one has and so on, which can ultimately influence lot of other aspects in your life. For example, if somebody is, let us say, a good looking, which may be because of genetic certain influence, this can draw positive social responses, people may smile, invite you more and try to befriend you and so on. So, there can be certain dynamics in the social environment which will influence by that aspect which is genetically influenced, that is how do you look and so on. Over time, this can increase self confidence, social skill. Now, these are indirect influences. So, through the influence of the genes. So, gene influenced how you look, which ultimately because then shapes the response of other people in the society, and then you develop self confidence, social skills. So, these are indirect influences. Gene is not directly influencing your self confidence or social skills, but it is influencing how do you look, and then it shapes how other people looks at you and interacts with you, which ultimately leads to development of self confidence and social skills. This is an example of indirect influence of genetics. So, here genetics affects behavior indirectly by changing how other people treat you or look at you, perceive you and so on, which in turn shapes other psychological development and so on. So, a lot of this could be indirect influence. Sometimes gene could have a multiplier effect. What does that mean? Small genetic advantage can be amplified by the environment. So, certain genetic advantages one can have in the body, which can be then amplified by lot of environmental influence. So, that advantage is then amplified by the environment. So, that is called multiplier effect. A small initial advantage, possibly genetic, alter environment and amplifies the original advantage. Just like similar earlier example that we give, how certain advantage in the how do you look, which could be genetic influence, and then you have so many other advantages coming around it because of the environmental influences. Here for example, one example is given from the sports field. Suppose you have a genes that make you tall and others that give you fast running skill. Let us say because of certain genetic influence your height is more, and then you have a little bit fast running skill and so on, which could be little bit influenced by the genetics. Now, this is an small advantage given by the genetics. So, you have a slight advantage in basketball, let us say, compared to other peers, simply because your height is more. So, you have a biological advantage in certain sports, let us say basketball, okay, which can lead to being selected for teams, receiving coaching, skill improvement, simply because of one genetic advantage. As your skill improves, you experience more success and receive further encouragement. So, then your success, encouragement and everything is indirectly coming from one genetic advantage. A small genetic advantage becomes magnified through interaction with the environment. So, this was a small genetic advantage which got amplified because of how environment interacts with that particular advantage. So, that is called a multiplier effect. Now, we should also understand that genetics effect need not be very rigidly like you cannot change it. There can be certain environmental influences can modify the impact of genetics also. So, there is a misconception that if a gene strongly influences a behavior or a trait, there is nothing we can do except genetic modification. So, if something is influenced by the gene, people generally think then without changing genetics you cannot change it. So, it is almost like a fixed thing. That is not true, because sometimes environment can influence and change the expression of gene without changing the genetic code itself. For example, let us take the case of phenylketonuria. It is a condition, it is an inherited metabolic disorder. So, it is the name of a disorder, in short it is called as PKU. What happens here? If it is untreated, leads to mental retardation. So, it is a condition which is largely genetic condition, inherited, it comes from the parents, and so there is a problem in the metabolism, which ultimately if not treated properly can lead to mental retardation. About 2% of people of European and Asian ancestry carry this recessive gene for PKU. Generally no African has it. So, it is most of the people it remains recessive, that means it is not directly expressing itself. So, that may not be a problem, but it remains as a recessive condition. Now, let us say if you have this gene on a normal diet, this particular phenylalanine accumulates in this particular condition in the brain, causing mental retardation. So, let us say you are not doing any changes or anything like this, but this gene is let us say dominant in you and you are taking normal diet, then it with the passage of time it can lead to mental retardation because of this accumulation of this particular substance called phenylalanine. However, let us say you change your diet low in this particular substance called phenylalanine. So, you take certain diets which in such a way that this particular substance is not there, then it will protect the brain, preventing this disorder. So, even though genetically this disorder is there in your genetic information, if you change your diet, it may not express itself simply because you are changing certain conditions. So, it will not find expression even though it is genetically there in your system. So, this shows that environmental intervention such as diet can modify or prevent the expression of genetic condition even with higher heritability, even though this can be a very dominant gene in your system. So, it is not always that if certain genetic information is there, it will rigidly and it will have impact on you, not necessarily. One can change the expression of lot of these genetics through changing environmental conditions. One example is this. So, this whole aspects of how environment can influence genetic expression is studied in a field called as epigenetics. So, this is epigenetics. It refers to changes in gene expression without altering DNA sequence. So, many times gene expression changes because of the environmental influence without altering DNA sequence. So, genetic information is not changed, it is exactly same as it is, but because of the changes in the environment or effect of environment, how this genetic information expresses it changes, expression changes itself without changing the genetic sequence itself. So, this is called as epigenetics. Now, these changes can be sometimes long lasting, sometimes reversible, means sometimes it can come back also. Environment changes, but this environment again is no longer there, it can reverse back also. It can be influenced by life experiences and so on. So, that is the whole area of epigenetics. Now, what influences epigenetic changes means changes in the expression of gene. Your early childhood experiences can influence how gene expresses. Parenting attachment, how parenting influence, what kind of emotional experiences you have, stress and trauma of life, what kind of stressful life experiences you have, do you go through a lot of traumatic experiences, all this can change certain genetic expression. What kind of nutrition you take, substance, what kind of substance you take, that can also influence social environment, poverty, adversity. All these factors can actually in many contexts can change the expression of genetics. So, we will see some examples. So, social environment is one of the factors that can influence genetic expression. So, social experience can alter gene expression without changing DNA. This forms the basis of behavioral genetics, as we already said. One of the landmark study that was done by Miani and his colleague in 2005 on rats, they showed that maternal care programs brain and stress response by epigenetics. So, they found how the mother of those rats, how they behave with their child rats, that actually changes the expression of certain genes. So, what kind of maternal care was given, it changes, it programs the brains and stress response, how a rat responds to a stress actually changes without changing the genetic sequence. So, maternal care is an important factor. So, this is what this study showed, that how early life experiences could alter genetic expression and change the stress response and so on. So, what is the psychological significance of this? So, early social experience can have long term stress vulnerability also, like what kind of experience people have in their childhood can have long term impact on how people respond to stress and what kind of vulnerability they develop. Maternal care can also have an impact intergenerationally, that impact could go from one generation to another generation also. So, this whole thing also provides a biological link between early adversity, mental disorders. Many times a lot of these mental disorders actually happens because certain adversity and traumatic event happens during childhood and so on. So, the impact of those negative event could be so strong that they create certain mental disorders, and it may not have anything like there may not be any genetic expression for that. Things like depression, PTSD and schizophrenia and so on could have many epigenetic expression also. So, particularly in the context of psychopathology, early adversity, abuse, neglect, trauma, all these experiences could be linked to depression, PTSD, schizophrenia. Epigenetics provide biological pathway linking early experience to mental disorders. So, even though one may not have such genetic propensity, still lot of this could come into existence simply because of environmental influences, or it can be amplified by the environment and so on. So, just continuing on the psychopathology part, epigenetics can explain how social adversity alters gene expression. So, when people are in a very disadvantaged position, poverty, lot of difficulties and traumatic experiences, it could change gene expression, and people can develop lot of conditions which were not part of the genetic expression. It shifts focus from just genetic defect to gene environmental interaction. So, many times things are not just genetic defects, because these things expresses simply because of environmental interaction also. Genetics directly is not responsible, but there can be certain propensities, but environment makes it more amplified and so on. So, if you look at particular case of schizophrenia, no single gene has been identified for this condition. Strong links to social risk factor like trauma, abuse, neglect, migration to some other areas. All these conditions could kind of increase the chances of schizophrenia beyond genetics. So, some of this evidence linked to abnormal DNA methylation in psychosis or those psychological disorders, certain biologically how it is expresses itself, altered glucocorticoid receptor regulation after childhood abuse, that certain chemical changes happens or biological changes happens in the body because of the actually outside environmental experiences, which has not direct genetic influence. So, what is the implication of this? That schizophrenia could be understood through genetic as well as social or environmental influences. Epigenetic changes mediate stress and brain system. Social and psychological intervention may reduce those vulnerability. So, even though somebody may have a strong genetic factors for schizophrenia and other psychosis, changing environment could reduce its probability of expression and so on. So, gene is not like this is a fixed condition that you cannot do anything about it. Environmental changes could either suppress and or either promotes its expression also. So, schizophrenia condition like schizophrenia or other psychosis could be shaped by social experiences acting through epigenetic mechanism, not fixed genetic destiny. Even though people may have some genetic predisposition for let us say schizophrenia, it is not necessary that it will express itself. It is the environmental condition that depends. So, certain social environmental experiences could very quickly express it, lead it to expression, and certain other conditions which like say more healthy and supportive environment could suppress its expression. So, these are all examples of epigenetic conditions that genetics is not a destiny for most of the cases. Environmental changes could either suppress or make it express. So, those factors are also very important. So, particularly the early life experiences plays very important role. Early childhood is a very sensitive period where what kind of environmental experiences one go through can alter lot of this genetic expression. Particularly caregiving quality shapes stress regulation, emotional control, vulnerable to disorder. How parents give caregiving to children plays very important role. So, early experiences becomes biologically embedded. So, lot of these experiences that we go through, particularly the early childhood experiences, they actually gets embedded in our biological system and can influence the expression of genetics also. So, even in the context of PTSD also, just like schizophrenia, there can be epigenetic expression to it. So, traumatic exposure can lead to changes in the gene expression. This can changes occur in the fear processing system, stress response pathways. So, this can change the genetic expression, even though there may not be such genetic expression, people can develop fear processing system or stress response can become highly developed simply because of traumatic experiences. This explains why some people develop PTSD, why not others, and why other people remain resilient. So, one of the factors could be obviously the genetic information, and another is how environment is influencing its expression. That can determine why somebody develops, even though two person may be experiencing same traumatic experience, but there can be differences in the expression. So, it could be a combination of both genetic and environmental factors. Epigenetics shows how experience shape biology. So, it is our social experiences, environmental experiences can shape our biological systems also. Gene can interact with the environment continuously and shape expression. Early life experience matters very deeply. Psychology and biology are inseparable. You cannot talk about psychology, biology always is an underpinning of all the psychological expression. So, these are some of the important concepts related to biological aspects, how biological basis of human behavior or biological basis of psychology. So, these are the two lectures that we covered here, both talks about the different aspects of biological system and how it influences behavior and psychological dimensions. The first lecture was about nervous system, brain and hormonal system. Today's lecture was on genetics and behavior. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.